Hello again, and welcome to our presentation on post-conflict political processes, and if we can call it that, reconciliation. In this segment, what I want to concentrate on is some of the domestic responses to the perceived failure of processes, especially processes rooted in criminal law. Because what we can say, I think, about the general post-conflict environment is that there is a widespread perception that processes have failed or have at least partly failed. Um, what have they failed in? If they may have succeeded at least partly in achieving legal goals and the prosecution and conviction of suspects, they have largely failed in achieving political and social goals, such as establishing a shared understanding of the past, of encouraging a posture of social responsibility, and probably also, very importantly, failed in addressing needs arising from violence for victims of violence. And so a number of initiatives have emerged in the region. What a lot of these initiatives have in common is that they are either initiatives that are rooted in dialogue, in bringing people from opposed groups, either within borders or across borders together, or they are initiatives that are interested in establishing and communicating facts. One of the initiatives, for example, that has been most prominent, although it's not likely to be successful in achieving its goal, is the Recom initiative, the initiative for a regional commission for establishing facts related to the conflicts of the 1990s in the territory of the former Yugoslavia. And what's interesting about this initiative, the Recom initiative, is that they avoid the words truth and reconciliation. They talk about themselves as a fact-finding commission, and I think this is one of the lessons that a lot of people have taken from the failure or the apparent failure of initiatives over the past couple of decades, and that is that efforts to try to package facts into an overall narrative truth, into a communication of the essence of the facts that are discovered, are bound to fail and are bound to meet with resistance, and that it's much more effective, rather than trying to tell the truth, to try to tell facts and let truth grow out of the facts for people involved as they find them out. Now, together with that, there has been a campaign on the part of several actors in this area to assert, together with a right to compensation and other rights guaranteed as part of the package of general human and civil rights, a right to truth. That is the contention that citizens of states have a right to know about the facts of events in which their states were involved, that victims have a right to know about the fate of people who were targeted by campaigns of violence and so on. So one of the conditions for this campaign to tell the facts, not the truth, is for the right to truth to be established and to be recognized. In the process of doing that, there have been a couple of interesting phenomena. One of them is that all of the campaigns to try to move beyond the limitations of legally based campaigns and to move toward dialogue and the establishment of facts have been efforts to create coalitions of various groups from civil society, and these include not only organizations interested in human rights and organizations of victims from various places or from various ethnic and national groups, but also bringing together groups from civil society who in some cases you might think would be opposed to one another, including religious leaderships, veterans groups, and so on, to bring them into dialogue with one another, and then eventually, although this has not been successful in every state of the region, to bring in governments as a participant in these dialogues, and finally to bring all of the governments of the regions as participants into dialogue with one another. This is a long-range goal that has not been achieved and may not have been achieved, but it's been postulated as a goal. one of the things that has been most interesting to see about this process is the very interesting role that is played by veterans groups in the promotion of dialogue. Because although there is a stereotype of veterans groups as being nationalistic in orientation, as being exclusive, as having a goal of wanting to turn their members and potential members into heroes and so on, there is another thing that happens when veterans get together, and that is that veterans from different opposing sides in the conflict find that they have interests in common. They have in common the sense that they have been damaged by the violence. They have in common very often needs that are either medical, whether related to physical or psychological health, and frequently material. That is the sense that the states that they fought for have obligations to them that have not been met. And so they form alliances. In more than one instance, in the meetings of these post-legal groups, you find the veterans intervening in arguments between the peace groups or victims groups or the religious groups or the intellectuals and saying, we don't understand what your problem is because us veterans have made peace with one another. We understand that we have an interest in common. And this is fascinating and also, I think, to a large degree unexpected. One of the challenges that is faced by all of these initiatives is that the response to them has not been massive. It has been limited and very largely limited to people who have a personal interest in the outcome of processes, and this interest tends to diminish over time as the violence and the conflict become less a part of the lived experience of people living in these states and more a part of memory or history that is more an object of abstraction. Another set of initiatives has to do with trying to move the focus of attention away from perpetrators and from perpetrating institutions, the way that criminal law does, and more toward victims and the needs of victims and addressing the needs of victims. And in this, a set of understandings has developed. First of all, that the needs of victims are both symbolic. That is to say, they have a need for recognition, for the ability to tell the story, to have the truth of their experience recognized, and they are also material. These are people who have been left without work, without housing, without income, and there is a campaign to try to encourage states to accept responsibility for making good the material needs of victims. In general, what the postulate behind victim-centered activity relates to most is the principle that while it might not be possible to undo harm that is done by violence, it may be possible to undo some of the consequences for survivors of violence, and that this can be important in the political and social and moral lives of states. But there is an element of political strategy in this as well. That is that there is a sense that if states recognize their obligations to victims, this provides a way in for the states eventually to recognize institutional responsibility for the fate of everybody involved in violence in the region, and eventually for historical responsibility. I also want to bring up some post-legal initiatives that have to do with the exploration of alternative paths to justice. That is, the raising of questions that are not strictly legal, but that have to do with the distribution of social benefits and political power and access to voice. And an example of this is the so-called Women's Court. This is a regional initiative that has been put together by a coalition of groups from states throughout the region that seeks to gather evidence, to educate, to produce materials relating to the ways in which the experience of violence intersects with unequal practices of power that relate especially to gender in the region. That is, to provide a campaign and to provide a way in for states to use their material to change their approach to the distribution of justice away from the relatively narrow approaches that are most frequently frequently used in criminal law. So this is a way, it's a vehicle to provide voice for people, and it's also a way of influencing state institutions that draws on the experience of similar initiatives doing similar things in other parts of the world. So what can we say generally about these post-conflict, post-legal efforts? I mean, one of the things that they contribute is they offer a step toward what might be called an intersectional critique of the set of activities that falls under the label of transitional justice. And that is that the effort to confine post-conflict activity to law, to the formal sphere of law, limits its scope and limits its application, separates it from the lives of people in a way similar to the way that neoliberalism and the privatization of economies and of control over public goods confines people's economic life to work and undermines public participation in the society. That is to say that some of this is contributing toward developing an approach to citizenship and to participation in the life of the state that is directly a consequence of the experience of violence. A final thing that we can say is that as in the previous section where we talked about denial, it said denial is not only a reflex, but also in some ways a source of creativity, a way for people to innovate new approaches. Response to disillusion and response to disappointment is also a source of creativity, and we can see some of that creativity in the activity of these post-legal initiatives.